I think that often people overcomplicate the ideas of color theory in illustration. There's lots of different ways you can apply color in illustration, and you can create very complicated color schemes, and sometimes that can be very good. And often when artists do get really good at applying complicated color and getting good at mixing very vibrant colors together, you get really interesting results. But equally so, I think a lot of really, really great art survives on very simple color schemes and very simple color plans. And what I want to do in this video is just a simple study session where we check out some art and look for how artists have managed to get images looking really strong, really vibrant, and really interesting, just using very simple complementary and sort of harmonious monochromatic color schemes. So we're just going to check out a bunch of art books and look at how different artists have applied very, very simple color schemes. And hopefully through doing this, you can maybe get some tips and ideas for how you can apply very simple color schemes in your own work and get really, really good results. Now, as usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is more of a laid back, just hang out. We're going to check out some art books. This is not heavily edited. It's not heavily scripted or anything. We're just hanging out, checking out some art books and trying to understand a lot about art theory in the process. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, the same style that I create all my comics and illustrations in, you can check out my free Quick Start Guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process. It's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. All right, here we are at the drawing table. Now, let's just check out some books and see whether we can find some good information about simple color scheme. So I've got a couple of different things here, a couple more books that I might sort of bring out on the table and look at. But again, I think a really good example of simple color schemes is JEAN GIRAUD, otherwise known as Mobius. Now, one of the interesting things about Mobius is that often there is a little bit of psychedelia with the colors. You can see here we've got greens and blues and purples and yellows and oranges. We've basically got every color, but still I think there is often a good overriding color sort of scheme and a color theory to everything. So here we have essentially this kind of, you know, it's a kind of a gray, but it is a kind of bluey, greeny gray in the background, and that is sort of contrasted by this kind of orange, right? So we do have like a very good basic kind of color scheme here, which is that obviously, right, like the main sort of object we've got is our kind of yellow orange, and the complement of that is going to be, you know, these kind of you know, blues, grays, that kind of thing. And if you kind of, you know, look here again, you know, you got something pretty close to this sort of bluey green sort of color there. And, you know, I think that kind of works pretty well, right? You know, you've got sort of blue-green, right? Complement that is kind of red-orange, right? That's kind of what we got. So you can see that overall, there's like a really good sense of like basic color scheme. And I think what Mobius does so well is, you know, sort of just add in these little flourishes and kind of go crazy. And it often makes us feel like there is this, again, this real sort of psychedelic bent to it. But again, there's a lot of basics underlying it. And that's, I think, is really important to often take away. Now, I think you'll often see with some of these different color schemes that, again, we are sort of pushing the idea of color theory quite a bit, but still, you know, we do have some basic logic going on here. There is often, you know, we sort of got yellows and, you know, then you've got your violets, your purples, right? Like this is a very basic complementary color scheme that's working. So even though it's quite exaggerated, yeah, there's often real sort of basics to it. And I think it's often that sort of overriding thing that allows you to kind of have this kind of crazy like greens and reds, right? This sort of bright primary colors. But often there are, you know, very, very nice, simple complementary color schemes that underlie everything. Again, we've got some nice sort of reds, oranges, and that's sort of complemented with these kind of, you know, sort of greeny dark blues. Again, we got some green and orange there. And I think it looks like, these ones were done a little bit earlier, maybe with sort of traditional. Some of the later ones were done, again, so much of this book is like not safe for YouTube, so I'll try and do my best. But yeah, I think if you kind of look at some of the later stuff that feels like it was, maybe not this exactly, but some of it feels like it was digitally colored as well. But here you see, again, really, really simple red-green color schemes. And I think this is something to take away from Mobius's work, is so often he has the guts to, add all these kind of like purples and all these kind of crazy colors. We sort of got the shadow here is quite it might not show up in the camera quite so much, but, there is real color there, real sort of purpleness to the shadowing there. But again, I think what often makes these sort of schemes so sort of striking is often just that very, very simple return to a complementary color scheme. What does, the main environment need to be, right? It's kind of a foresty green. Let's have a red character walking through it. I often sort of talk about Little Red Riding Hood as a good example of a color scheme that works. And what you need to think about is often the more you get better at this, the more you get better at actually thinking in these terms. Like, where is the setting? What is a good sort of set design, way that you might kind of create an environment and create characters that go in there that kind of all work. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be this kind of thing where, you're like, well, how do they come up with that? It's like, well, often the environments is designed to show off the characters and vice versa. So, again, I think you can always see that even though the color is very sophisticated and sort of crazy, often what underlies a lot of really, really good Mobius art is just a simple, good, complementary color scheme. And again, it's more sophisticated than that. I'm not trying to make it reductive, but we can learn a lot from this. And I think if you just follow a lot of these basic image plans, again, you too will find images that just probably tend to work, even though the use of color is pretty crazy. Talking about having a good set design, a good visual idea, you can't really get any better than Miyazaki's Porco Rosso. Essentially what you have is a red plane on a blue sea and a blue sky. And what you sort of tend to find is that, this works. It's a great primary color scheme. We got sort of greens and reds, blues and reds, very kind of striking, strong color scheme. And again, if you kind of think of a lot of the advertising material and the way, I guess this is one of my sort of favorite sort of Miyazaki films, the kind of thing you take away from it is the blues of the ocean, the blues of the sky. And again, it's just such a striking image. And, these things are designed, right? From the traditional sort of original kind of comic version of it to the production design to the sort of finished cells, it really kind of works. You've got very, very simple color schemes that tend to work again and again. And I think this is something you can also look at when, it comes to many of the backgrounds in Ghibli films. They often have these kind of very traditional Ghibli sort of greeny blue forest scenes, right? And it's so important to just understand that, these things just tend to work. There's no point kind of reinventing the wheel, as it were. Again, simple, nice monochromatic sort of scenes. Again, not everything is kind of bright and vibrant, but again, the overall kind of color scheme, I think, is very sort of nicely designed. And I think it does give us this kind of classic image that always works. But what you tend to find is that even if you look at sort of different Ghibli artists, again, I've got some different sort of versions of this because this often talks to, again, this simplicity of, probably what we could look at as a very sort of harmonious color scheme, an analogous color scheme of the Ghibli's use of these sort of greens and blues and just kind of how this works. And it is just a very, very simple analogous color scheme. So the way this sort of works on the color wheel is just that, where are we? We're kind of in a green field with a blue sky. right? Which, again, often gives us like quite a strong color sort of contrast, because again, those are not necessarily colors that are always going to work together. You've sort of got your blue of the sky, and where are the greens? They're kind of these analogous sort of colors here. So we're not using complements, we're not using anything that kind of vibrates. These are often backgrounds, but this is a very simple color scheme that will tend to work. You need green fields, you need blue skies. Then we're just going to deal with an analogous color scheme where we're going to deal with colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And that will tend to work every single time. So I think often people really admire these Ghibli backgrounds. And again, just for sort of reference, this is Oga Kazuo Animation Artworks, and my understanding is he is a major part of the Ghibli sort of background look. Has painted a lot of these kind of cool scenes and things that we kind of remember from classic Ghibli films. And again, we're just looking at very, very simple analogous color schemes. We've got blues, greens, there's yellows. Now these are designed as backgrounds, and so often there will be a character on top of this that does pop, right, and really kind of comes out. But again, it's so important to understand that very frequently, really sort of good images will be created from simple, harmonious, analogous color schemes. And all you have to think about initially is sort of where is the setting? What typical colors is that going to need to be? What time of day it is? And this is where, again, you can obviously have a green field that has that classic sort of Ghibli green to it. You can have something that's a little bit more autumnal, sort of a bit more yellowy brown. You can have the green, but you can also, just by changing the time of day, make a green forest feel very different by setting it at magic hour or whatever you need to do. So there's often a lot of optionality when it comes to thinking about how you change the look of a particular setting. But I think it's so important to understand that often what we're trying to do in the beginning as sort of aspiring artists is, really struggle to kind of like add color. I want to add stuff. I want to do so many things. This is like a great example of using sort of multiple colors and, different things. But very frequently, color schemes that work are a lot more pared back. We are just sort of dealing with very, very simple, as I said, analogous, harmonious color schemes. And I think a lot of the Ghibli background work there is a great example of that we always need to remember. Now, I often like to bring up Frank Frazetta because I think his art really does embody a lot of the simplicity of design and thinking that I think we can draw a lot from as aspiring artists. And, often I think the thing that I really always come back to is how much color do you actually need to use? Now, these things obviously work from a painting standpoint, but they would also work from a line and color standpoint, a more sort of stylized look. But so often what you see with Frazetta's work is essentially like a monotonal image, right? Or a monochromatic image. And, these kind of really, really work. They're very strong. They're very sort of simple. And often what we're dealing with here is just like, the basics here. Let's see if I can get this a little bit sharper. Yeah, we're just dealing with what is a simple color scheme that tends to work, that tends to kind of tie everything in. And often there's an excellent expert use of warm and cool colors within that color scheme, which kind of shifts it to more of a tonalist painting. But I think often Frazetta's subtle use of color really, really, comes to the fore here. And again, it's a really good example of how you can use monochromatic sort of color schemes, and they can really be exciting and really sort of interesting. But it's just worthwhile paying attention to the subtlety in the way that he does sort of build this. Because I think you can learn a lot from just sort of looking at, again, the way that these are simply planned out. So we have sort of a green, yellow color scheme, so fairly kind of analogous, harmonious there. Not a lot of sort of drastic contrast, but this is where, again, you start to get a little bit more sophisticated. there's some real sort of areas of vibrancy in there, mixed with a lot of real kind of monotone sepia work, and it's often these kind of little color vibrancies within a much more sort of simpler palette that allow people to play with this. And I think often the thing that we can mess up in the beginning as aspiring artists is that again, this is like such a crazy color scheme, so weird and psychedelic, but I think it's often just a very simple sort of baseline for an image that allows you to experiment and do some of that thing where you really kind of, put some vibrant color in here, some vibrant color in there. And again, it's often that allows you to experiment. If you get a very simple color scheme in the beginning, just pick something monotonal and maybe something analogous, then that's what really allows you to play with that paint, right? And push and pull, add some vibrancy. But I think one of the things that Forde does the best, right, that we can always sort of learn from is this kind of monotonal color scheme with like a little color pop, right? And this is like a color scheme that always tends to work really, really well. I think I probably need to make like a whole video just on this sort of simple idea because it's so effective. Basically, it's all one color, except again, we just got sort of a little bright pop or two of a very sort of, vibrant color. And you can see that a lot of the background colors here are sort of cooler, right? We've sort of got some cool colors here, these weird sort of bird creature things in the background are kind of a bluey, purpley, right? We got this kind of weird, amorphous, smoky, painted cape that's red, right? Very, very striking image. And the color theory here is very sophisticated, right? There's a lot of subtlety to the way the skin is painted, but the overall color scheme is a very, very sort of simple plan. And I think this is the kind of thing that you're going to, find again and again with these images. And it's just worthwhile sort of paying attention to, right? Because often these images are so interesting and kind of so strong, but in the same way that, JEAN GIRAUD will have like a very basic complementary color scheme, here you're often seeing very simple monochromatic analogous color schemes with, again, some simple kind of color exaggeration and a lot of this kind of impressionist style playing with hues and kind of experimenting and messing around that gives it that little bit of extra sauce, that little bit of extra vibrancy that really kind of makes it come to life. And again, even when you have some of these things where it does feel very psychedelic, right? You got all these kind of crazy colors. What you notice is like most of it is just brown, right? And again, there's a lot of other sort of things there that will kind of play into that. But yeah, a lot of the stuff that will work here is just simple monochromatic color schemes tend to always work, especially when you add a little pop of color somewhere. And just lastly, I thought I'd sort of mention this and sort of throw this in there if you want a good example of someone using a very, very simple color scheme. I basically created this entire book and I set it in a forest because I knew that color scheme was something I was comfortable with and I knew that it would kind of work. So you can see that the general color scheme is displayed more or less on the cover. We have greeny blue environment and the characters are kind of, you have this sort of yellowy sort of skin, right? Except this character who kind of blends in a little bit more, he's kind of green and mixed with that. And that basically was the general kind of color scheme. And more or less, I kind of follow that throughout the entire book. There's a lot of this basic color scheme that is something that will tend to work. And I sort of counterbalance that with this alternative red world, right, where the kind of witches are scheming. But again, what you'll notice is like red contrasts very well with that. You can sort of see this on the cover. We've got the red sticker. It really kind of pops from that. So very simple color scheme, very simple application of the idea where we think about where is our setting. It's in a forest. Okay, most of these things are green. We're going to have these characters with lighter skin on top of that. That's going to sort of pop pretty well. In fact, early on, one of the things, and you see this color scheme basically just pervades the entire book. It's just kind of one, right? It's just like one monochromatic / analogous color scheme with a slight kind of color pop of the sort of yellow of the character. But interestingly enough, when I was sort of designing this, I was thinking in a similar way to like what would be a good color combination. I actually designed these characters, these kind of forest creatures, to be red in the beginning, because I thought that would actually be a good sort of color contrast, but that didn't quite happen, and I ended up sort of painting them in a sort of weird way, so they became a little bit more like the forest and sort of part of that environment. But yeah, this is a very, very simple, easy to replicate color scheme. We've got greens and blues, exactly in the same vein as a lot of those Ghibli background paintings. Yeah, probably would have benefited from giving the main character like a red cloak or something like that to really kind of pop. But again, you know, this kind of worked for me, and I think what I would sort of leave us with is just this one thought, which is, I think this is what I typically recommend people do. This is what I did, is I was struggling with the idea of having a huge variety of different settings and scenes and things that I needed to do for comics. So one of the first things I did is I set an entire comic in, like, you know, maybe 2 or 3 different settings, and that allowed me to simplify the drawing, the production, and I didn't really have to worry about, you know, how to make very, very different environments work from a coloring standpoint, because that was something that was very challenging for me, was to figure out, like, okay, like, how do I get this type of scene to work? How do I get that type of scene to work? You know, I was much more comfortable with this color palette. So certainly feel free to do that. You don't need to go crazy. Often just keep it simple is the best strategy. So anyway, let me know if you know, this little sort of study session helped. Again, it's just a really basic concept that I think is worth repeating again and again, is that you don't need to create some crazy exaggerated color scheme for absolutely everything, especially if the story you're telling, the type of art you're telling, doesn't necessarily require it. Often it can be effective to just pick very, very simple analogous color schemes, right? Colors that are kind of next to each other on the color wheel, because they'll tend to go pretty well together. And typically that means, you know, like 3 or 4, not more than sort of 5, I think, is the general rule. You don't sort of want to go crazy. Obviously, then you're just using all the colors. Yeah, and then think about what is the sort of complements to those, because that's what will kind of allow things to pop or to suddenly give you some sort of vibrancy or sort of pull attention, pull focus. But yeah, you can get a lot done with more or less a monochromatic color scheme. But yeah, anyway, as I said, let me know whether this one was sort of useful. Let me know whether you got any color questions in the comments down below. And other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.